Imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where the two most powerful nations of Asia, once rivals for centuries, suddenly decide to stand together. A world where the factories of China and the software minds of India no longer compete but unite, where their combined strength challenges the very foundation of global power. For America, this isn't just a concern, it's a nightmare, because what happens when nearly 3 billion people, armed with technology, resources, and ambition, choose cooperation over conflict? Tonight, we are going to explore that possibility. We'll uncover why this alliance could shift the balance of power faster than anyone expects, why it terrifies Washington, and why it matters for the future of every person listening right now. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll see the world in a way you never have before. China and India have for centuries been seen as rivals, each with their own deep civilizational pride, vast populations, and growing ambitions. Yet the idea of them as strategic partners carries with it a transformative power that few in the West fully grasp. Historically, these two nations have clashed over territory, ideology, and influence, and their competition has often been used by external powers as a way to keep both from rising too quickly. But history also demonstrates that when great rivals manage to find common ground, the outcome can alter the balance of global power. If these two ancient civilizations, once centers of trade, knowledge, and empire, decide to collaborate in the modern age, it will not merely be a regional shift, but a global turning point. Together, they represent nearly 3 billion people, almost half the world's population, and their combined demographic strength alone creates a gravitational pull no country can ignore. A united vision could allow them to pool resources, markets, and strategies in ways that magnify their influence far beyond their borders. The very idea of China and India aligning is unnerving for the United States and the West, because it would challenge the decades-long assumption that these two giants would always remain at odds, thereby preventing any consolidated Asian power bloc. If, however, necessity, pragmatism, or shared interests push them toward cooperation, the world order could change faster than anyone expects. History tells us that such realignments are not just theoretical. Moments of cooperation between rivals have often sparked new systems of trade, technology, and governance that reshape continents. The psychological impact of two ancient rivals embracing partnership would itself inspire a sense of inevitability about Asia's rise. It would also revive their historical identities not merely as separate powers, but as pillars of global civilization capable of offering an alternative to Western-led models. What makes this potential so powerful is not only their population size or economic weight, but their symbolic force of two countries that were colonized, undermined, and restrained for centuries, suddenly finding alignment and asserting that the future of the world belongs not to the past hegemonies, but to those willing to redefine power through unity. That is why this first keynote is foundational, because it sets the stage for understanding why the mere possibility of China and India choosing partnership over rivalry is seen as one of the greatest nightmares for America. When examining the combined economic potential of China and India, it becomes clear why their partnership could be a game changer on the global stage. Together, these two nations represent nearly 3 billion people, making them the largest consumer base the world has ever seen. Their sheer demographic weight means that global corporations, investors, and markets cannot ignore them. China has already established itself as the world's factory, with vast industrial capacity, infrastructure, and an unparalleled ability to scale production quickly and efficiently. India, on the other hand, has built its reputation in services, IT, and entrepreneurship, with a younger population that is increasingly digital, educated, and innovative. If these two economies were to synchronize their strengths, they would create a self-sustaining engine of growth that could rival, and in many cases surpass, the influence of Western economies. Consider manufacturing. China's dominance in this space is undisputed, but it faces rising labor costs and international pushback. India's cheaper labor pool, expanding infrastructure, and pro-business reforms make it an attractive complement. A partnership where China provides advanced industrial ecosystems and India contributes its workforce and service expertise would make their combined supply chains nearly unbreakable. Moreover, their energy demands and investments in renewable sources, nuclear power, and alternative energy corridors could reshape global energy markets, reducing dependence on oil routes controlled by the West. The consumer potential is equally staggering. As incomes rise, the Chinese and Indian middle classes together could exceed 1 billion people in the next decade, a market far larger than that of the United States and Europe combined. This consumer force would drive demand for everything from technology and automobiles to healthcare and education, giving companies within China and India home field advantages while reducing the reliance on Western imports. Add to this the growing role of financial cooperation, where both countries are exploring alternatives to the US dollar in trade, and you see a blueprint for economic autonomy. The nightmare for America is not just the size of this market, but the fact that it could operate outside Western control, creating trade systems, currency agreements, and economic institutions rooted in Asia rather than Washington or Brussels. By combining their markets, resources, and human capital, China and India have the potential to dominate global economic flows in ways that would make it nearly impossible for the West to contain or counter. This synergy is not just addition. It is multiplication, and that is what makes the possibility so alarming to America. China and India possess very different yet highly complementary strengths in the field of technology and innovation, and it is this contrast that makes their potential collaboration so powerful. China has emerged as a global leader in hardware, infrastructure, and manufacturing, building everything from smartphones and semiconductors to high-speed rail and advanced robotics. Its model thrives on scale, efficiency, and the ability to mass-produce complex technologies at a pace unmatched by most of the world. India, in contrast, has carved out its dominance in software development, IT services, and human capital, producing some of the best programmers, engineers, and digital entrepreneurs on the planet. Where China excels in physical output, India shines in intellectual creativity and problem-solving. If these two strengths were fused together, the result would be a comprehensive technology ecosystem that could rival or even surpass that of the United States. For decades, the West has maintained its edge by controlling both hardware and software pipelines, ensuring that no other region could become self-sufficient. But if China provides the hardware and India the software, the need for Western platforms and technologies diminishes significantly. Imagine Chinese factories producing advanced processors, smart devices, and 5G infrastructure, while Indian developers write the software, build the platforms, and create the digital ecosystems that run on this hardware. It would mean a vertically integrated model where innovation is not dependent on Silicon Valley or European hubs, but entirely powered by Asia. Artificial intelligence is a prime example. China has already invested billions in AI research, facial recognition, and big data analytics, while India has an endless supply of young engineers capable of building AI applications across healthcare, education, and governance. Together, they could accelerate the adoption of AI at a global scale, shaping the rules of this transformative technology in their own favor. Similarly, in space exploration, China's advancements in rockets and satellites could combine with India's cost-efficient space missions to create a competitive alternative to NASA and SpaceX. Even in digital payments, India's innovations like UPI and China's Alipay and WeChat Pay, if connected, could form a financial network larger than anything seen in the West. This is what makes their cooperation a nightmare scenario for America. The United States has long relied on technological dominance as its ultimate weapon of influence. But if China and India unite their hardware and software power, they will not only become self-reliant, but also set new global standards, forcing the world to adapt to their systems instead of Western ones. For the United States, the greatest strategic fear is not China rising alone or India rising alone, but the two aligning in a way that reshapes the global balance of power. America has relied for decades on a strategy of keeping these Asian giants apart, often highlighting their disputes and encouraging competition to ensure no unified front could emerge against Western dominance. But if that barrier were to collapse and China and India were to cooperate in meaningful ways, the very foundations of American influence in Asia would be shaken. Militarily, America's strength comes not just from its arsenal, but from its web of alliances across the Indo-Pacific, from Japan to Australia. A China-India understanding would disrupt this balance, because it would remove India from the role Washington has envisioned for it as a counterweight to Beijing. Instead of being part of America's strategic hedge, India could become part of a partnership that neutralizes U.S. leverage in the region. Economically, such an alliance would weaken the dominance of the U.S. dollar. Both China and India have shown interest in creating alternative payment systems, exploring local currency trade, and backing institutions like BRICS, New Development Bank. If they combine their weight behind financial independence, America's most powerful instrument, control over global finance, would face its most serious challenge. The U.S. has historically been able to sanction adversaries, cut off markets, and use the dollar as a political weapon. But a China-India financial bloc would create a massive parallel system capable of absorbing much of the global south into its orbit, making sanctions less effective and Washington's leverage far weaker. Diplomatically, the nightmare becomes even clearer. A united front between the two most populous nations on Earth would give enormous legitimacy to calls for a multipolar world. Their combined voices in global forums could press for reforms in the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF, tilting these institutions away from American leadership. Moreover, in projects like infrastructure development, where America has struggled to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, India's participation could transform these efforts from a single country project into a joint Asian vision with even greater reach and credibility. In essence, America's fear is not just about losing ground to one competitor, but about facing two powerful rivals who amplify each other's strengths and minimize each other's weaknesses. The nightmare lies in the realization that if China and India stand together, America is no longer the unquestioned leader of the world order, but one player in a multipolar arena where its dominance is no longer assured. Both China and India share a deep interest in building a multipolar world where no single nation dominates the global order. And it is this shared vision that forms the strongest basis for cooperation between them. For decades, the international system has been heavily influenced, if not outright controlled, by the United States and its allies. From financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank to political platforms such as the UN Security Council, the rules of the game have largely been written in Washington or Brussels. China and India, as rising powers, recognize that if they remain divided, they will be forced to operate within this Western-designed framework, always constrained by rules that do not reflect their own aspirations. But together, they can rewrite the terms of engagement and create an alternative that reflects the priorities of Asia and the global South. Energy is a key area where their interests converge. Both nations are massive energy consumers, heavily dependent on imports, and vulnerable to disruptions in supply lines controlled by Western naval powers. By coordinating on projects like alternative pipelines, renewable energy investments, and shared access to Central Asian resources, they can reduce dependence on Western, controlled routes and safeguard their long-term growth. Infrastructure is another domain of common interest. China's Belt and Road Initiative seeks to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through trade corridors, while India has its own ambitions through projects like the International North-South Transport Corridor. If these initiatives are aligned rather than competing, they would create vast networks of connectivity across continents, redefining global trade in ways that minimize America's influence. Their cooperation also extends into global institutions. Both countries are part of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, platforms designed to reduce Western dominance and promote alternative centers of power. In these forums, China and India often find themselves aligned in resisting Western pressure and advocating for reforms that give emerging economies a greater voice. Even though their bilateral tensions remain, when it comes to resisting Western dominance, their interests align remarkably well. This alignment is reinforced by the fact that both countries see themselves as representatives of billions in the developing world, nations that have long felt marginalized by Western hegemony. The nightmare for America is that such shared interests, once aligned, can grow into durable partnerships. A joint China-India push for a multipolar system would not only reduce U.S. influence but also inspire other nations to join them, accelerating the shift away from Western-centric power structures and bringing the world closer to an order no longer dominated by America. Despite the enormous potential of a China-India partnership, the road to such cooperation is filled with obstacles that cannot be ignored. The most visible challenge is their long-standing border disputes, which have led to deadly clashes in recent years and created a climate of mistrust that is deeply rooted in both governments and populations. These territorial tensions are more than just lines on a map. They represent questions of sovereignty, pride, and national identity, making compromise extremely difficult. For two rising powers with strong nationalist narratives, stepping back is politically costly, and this continues to stand in the way of genuine partnership. Beyond borders, there is the larger issue of historical rivalry. Both nations see themselves as natural leaders of Asia, and this competition often translates into diplomatic friction. India has long viewed China's Belt and Road Initiative with suspicion, seeing it as an attempt to encircle and limit Indian influence, while China has grown wary of India's growing ties with the United States, Japan, and other Western allies. These opposing alignments create a strategic distrust that complicates any vision of deep cooperation. Economic competition is another significant barrier. While cooperation could multiply their strengths, the reality is that both nations are competing for foreign investment, trade markets, and influence over emerging economies. For example, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and even within BRICS, both countries are vying to be seen as the main partner of choice for developing nations. This competition sometimes overshadows their complementary strengths and makes it difficult to fully align on shared goals. Additionally, domestic politics play a crucial role. Both governments are highly sensitive to public perception, and nationalist sentiments often flare up quickly whenever tensions arise. This makes sustained cooperation difficult, as political leaders may find it easier to gain support by appealing to rivalry rather than partnership. Despite these challenges, global realities may push them toward collaboration out of necessity. Both countries face pressures from the West, vulnerabilities in energy security, and aspirations to build a new economic order less dependent on the dollar. Necessity has a way of reshaping rivalries, and while mistrust will remain, strategic pragmatism could lead to selective partnerships in trade, technology, and diplomacy. Still, the fragility of this relationship is exactly what makes it uncertain and unpredictable. For America, this unpredictability is as troubling as the alliance itself, because even the possibility of China and India overcoming their divisions is enough to alter strategic calculations across the world. In the end, the idea of China and India joining hands is not just a geopolitical theory, it is a possibility with the power to rewrite the story of the 21st century. Their combined populations, their complementary strengths in technology, their shared appetite for economic growth, and their mutual desire for a multipolar world create a vision that unsettles America more than any single rival could. The truth is, both nations face deep challenges to cooperation, rivalries, mistrust, and unresolved disputes. But history teaches us that necessity often turns rivals into allies when the stakes are high enough. If they choose unity, the impact would be seismic. Economies would realign, global institutions would shift, and the dominance of the West would face its greatest test. If they remain divided, the world continues along familiar lines, but the very possibility of their cooperation keeps the global order on edge. This is why the nightmare for America is not simply the rise of China or India, but the vision of them standing side by side, shaping a future that belongs less to the past powers and more to the emerging ones. Good luck on your journey of learning, growth, and discovery, and thank you for staying with me until the end.